you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Well, good. I would like to begin, if I may, with 2 words of thanks of my own. And the first is to you all for allowing me to speak to you in my own language. This is a huge privilege, and it's one that Anglophones in particular must never take for granted. So thank you all very much. Thank you also, especially to Jan, for your invitation. I'm extremely sorry not to be in Prague, and you've drunk all that wine already. Prague, I think, is the most beautiful city I have ever visited, and I was so much looking forward to coming back, but maybe I'll have a chance in the future. And meanwhile, I want to thank Jan very warmly for persevering with the idea of inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm just sorry that I'm only in 2 dimensions, but I hope you can see me as well as hear me. Well, the view of civil liberty I want to talk about used to be almost universally accepted in European legal and political thought, but it's been eclipsed in modern times with the rise to hegemony of the claim that we need to think of freedom as non-interference with our actions. And at least in Anglophone philosophy, that view remains completely dominant. But what I want to aspire to do in this talk is not only to provide an account of the rejected view, but also to suggest that it really is the view that we ought to re-adopt. It's as simple as that. Now, I label this rejected view neo-Roman because it was largely drawn from classical Roman sources. Now, I would now want to add that these sources were essentially legal in character. They were juristic. I've come to feel that far too much attention in studying this theory of freedom has been devoted to the European tradition of Republican political theory. That even applies to Philip Pettit's discussions, although I do want to start by saying that Philip has, in my view, made by far the most important contribution, at least in the Anglophone discussion, to reviving the way of thinking about civil liberty that I want to discuss. But what I would want to say historically, and as has been noted and in my title, I'm going to talk first historically and then more conceptually about the value of this theory. What we have to begin by recognizing is that this theory is squarely drawn throughout the European tradition from what I've come to think is the most influential text of political theory that Europe inherited from antiquity, and that is the Codex of Roman Law, and especially that part of Roman civil law that was known as the Digest. And that's why I prefer to describe the theory I'm discussing as neo-Roman in provenance. I speak of this as being a European inheritance, because Roman law was and still is taught in the universities throughout Europe. But I have to admit that my examples will tend to come from the Anglophone tradition of moral and political philosophy. That's not because I think it's the most important one, of course not, but it is the one that I happen to know about. And I always think it's best to talk about what you know about. Right, we need to start with Roman law. We need to start with the Digest of Roman law, and we need to start with its beginning. And the Digest of Roman law begins with chapters called Of the Status of Men and Women, beginning of book 1. Now, that source never ceases to be invoked, but for my present purposes, which, as I say, are slightly Anglophone, it is important that that account was incorporated. The whole analysis of persons in Roman law was adopted word for word into the earliest and massively influential compilation of common law. That's a text called De Legibus, traditionally associated with the name of William de Bracton, written in the mid-13th century. And common law, I mean, English common law turned out to be historically important because, of course, it was adopted in the United States of America. Just look at what a mess they're making of it. But anyway, there is a major common law tradition as well. The crucial thing is that in this way, the common law tradition does not differ at all from the Roman law tradition. What you have to focus on is what is being said in the Roman law about persons. Well, the digest begins by saying, I'm now quoting, of course, translating the Latin, the whole of law is concerned either with persons or things or actions. But since persons are of the greatest importance, because all laws are established for them, we must first consider persons and their status. So the digest goes on, here is the principal and briefest division of the status of persons. All men and women are either free persons or else they are slaves. So the digest first gives an account of what is meant by the freedom of free persons and what is meant by the servitude of slaves. First, freedom. I quote the digest. The freedom of free persons consists in being able to exercise their natural power of living as they wish. So the only systematic limitation on this freedom, and I'm still quoting the digest, arises from the fact that the actions of free persons may sometimes be prohibited by law or else by force. Well, obviously those are important constraints, but the point is that beyond that, you're being told that a free person enjoys the freedom of basically, as the Roman law says, vivere libet, to live as you choose. So you could say the analysis begins by considering the idea of free action. Being free to act is being able to act as you will. But what is crucial to the analysis is the claim that you can only act freely if you are a free person. And thus what you most need to understand is what does it mean to be a free person, a liber homo in the Latin, of course, homo meaning man or woman. What does it mean to be a free man or woman? Now, as the digest has already said, what it means to be a free person is not to be a slave. So what follows is that if you want to understand the concept of liberty, what you really need to understand is what does it mean to be a slave? So the digest gives an explication of the concept of slavery. I quote again, slavery is that condition in which someone is, contrary to nature, but due to an institution of the law of natures, subject to the power, subjectum dominio, subject to the power of someone else. So there's the definition of slavery. Now notice that by contrast with the Aristotelian tradition, slavery is said to be contra naturam. It is against nature. That is, in nature, everyone is free. Everyone is equally free in nature. But the law of nations, the jus gentium, permits slavery because it permits slavery due to conquest. And so, for example, in Britain, slavery was permitted until it was decided that it was only the law of nations that permitted slavery and that the common law ought not to do so. But that Act of Parliament was passed unbelievably late. I mean, 1833. So there is the original legal definition of liberty and slavery. And what's crucial for me this morning is that that definition yields two defining characteristics of this pivotal idea of the free person. One is that if everyone is either free or a slave, then this is obvious, a free person is someone who is not a slave. Okay, what is it to be a free person? It is not to be subject to the power and hence subject to the mere will of anyone else. That's freedom. The other characteristic of the free persons we've already seen. Because you are not subject to the will of anyone else, you are subject only to your own will. You can do what you like. You can follow your own will. Choose your pathway through life without having to concern yourself or be deferent to other people. So there's the analysis. I just need to add one point to avoid confusion, which is that it must be admitted that the Neo-Roman tradition does eventually divide over this issue of freedom and the will. This is a huge issue, which I'm not going to go into, except to say that some later exponents of the theory, in the Anglophone tradition, John Locke is the most significant, maintained that the mark of a free person is not vivere libet, that they do whatever they want, but that they do what reason dictates. So for someone like Locke, anyone who manages to use their reason may be said to act freely. But if, and notice this metaphor, you become a slave to your passions, then you do not act freely. And that in the English language is the crucial distinction between liberty and license. You act freely if you act according to reason, which of course is also said to be the law of God. You act licentiously if you just do whatever you want, drink all the wine. However, that is not in the original legal version. The lawyers are not interested in policing our choices. They're not moral philosophers. I mean, Locke isn't a moral philosopher. He wants to moralize the idea of freedom of action. But for the originary version of the Neo-Roman version of liberty, and I would say the contemporary version, certainly my own view, is that the only question is, are your choices undominated? Not, are they also rational and wise, or anything like that. Okay, but there's an obvious question to ask about the analysis I've put forward, which is, how does the fact of not being a free person mean that you can't act freely? Now, this is very important. If you are not a free person, that's to say, if you are in the power of someone else, if you're subject to their will, then obviously you never act exclusively according to your own will. Because all your actions, although they may be the product of your will also be the product of the will of the person to whom you are subject, that will being silently expressed in the form of permission for you to act. This is someone who has you in their power. They could always act to stop you from doing something. Often they don't. Insofar as they don't, you can act, but you don't act exclusively according to your own will. You act cum permissu, as the law says. All your actions are permissions. Okay, well, the legal sources leave the theory of freedom and slavery at that point. But this is the moment to mention that in Roman moral and political philosophy, as opposed to the law, a further and closely connected point was often added, and I need to add it at this stage, and that is that if you are a slave, that's to say, wholly subject to the will of someone else, it will not be long before you come to recognize you are. I mean, of course, Rome is a slave society, so you could be born a slave, and if you're born a slave, you don't know that you're a slave. But very soon, you're going to come to see that you are a slave, i.e., you're living entirely at the mercy of someone else. Now, the reason that interests the moral and political is, once you've seen that, that cannot fail to affect the pattern of your behavior. If I'm living entirely at your mercy, it's going to be crucial for me to do everything I can to appease you, to please you, not to irritate you, and so on. So it's not just that all my actions have the character of permissions. I'm also going to circumscribe my actions myself. because I've got to keep out of trouble. I'm wholly at the mercy of someone else. So what the moral philosophers like to stress, Seneca, of course, but above all Tacitus, is the hard and shocking truth that slavery cannot fail to make you slavish. How could it be otherwise? And it is built into the Latin and the English language. I mean, servitude produces servility. Now, one further complication in my exposition, you could say that what we've established here is the Roman law view of freedom, incredibly influential, is that the antonym of freedom is not interference, it is subjection to the will of others. So that is the simplest account I can give you of the difference between the contemporary liberal way of thinking about freedom, its absence of interference, and the Roman law view, its absence of subjection to the will of others. But there is a complicating distinction in the Roman law, and I need to add it. The Digest draws a contrast between those who are able to act, as it says, sui juris, that is, in their own right. In English, we have this phrase, you're being a law unto yourself. Do you have a similar phrase? Anyway, the Roman law source is crucial. It is, are you or are you not sui juris, able to act in your own right? Now, the obvious case of people who are not is slaves, but the law says, now there are others. Now, these people are not slaves, but they are unable fully to act in their own right. So the complicating thing is you're being told that to be a slave is to lack liberty, of course, but to lack liberty is not necessarily to be a slave. Now, the Digest is interested in just one class of persons, and it's the only joke you'll ever find in the Digest, and the class of persons is children. And of course, the Latin word for children is liberi. The joke is they are not liberi, they're not wholly free. That is because they're subject to parental power. And in Roman law, parental power was extremely extensive. It included life and death. But conceptually, of course, this distinction between not being wholly free but not being a slave, that's of the greatest importance. Because if you don't have that distinction, you are going to dilute the concept of slavery, I mean, the appalling fact of slavery, if you like, to a morally outrageous degree. And it must be admitted that in the early modern heyday of the neo-Roman theory, that dilution happened all the time. I mean, to take the most famous example, when the British Parliament in 1765 decides directly to tax the American colonies, although the colonists were not represented in Parliament, the colonists say, well, this means that we are now subject to the mere will of Parliament without our consent, and that is slavery. But even at the time, they were ridiculed because they actually owned slaves. So they ought to have known that, I mean, George Washington ought to have known that although he owned slaves, he was not himself a slave. But the Roman law would want to say, well, he wasn't wholly sui juris. And that distinction is therefore of the greatest moral importance. Well, there's as brief an account as I can manage to give you of the basic neo-Roman understanding. But I want to add one thing which is very important conceptually and historically to it, which is that a particular understanding of rights goes with this view. And to bring that out, I need to note an implication of the neo-Roman understanding of liberty. It's there, but let me just spell it out. If you're a free person, it's not just that you are free from interference, although of course you are. But the point is, you are free from the possibility of interference. And that is because if there's anyone who could interfere with you acting as you will, that's to say that you must be in their power. But that's to say that you're not a free person. So to say that you are a free person, this is crucial. It's not just to say you have de facto freedom of action. It is to say that you have secure freedom of action. Now, that's a claim which, when people like me make it in contemporary discussion, has been very much objected to. And I'm thinking, for example, of an important intervention by Professor Brennan, Professor Lomaski, and so on. They say, look, no citizen can realistically expect to be granted that degree of security. To live among other people is inescapably to live vulnerable to arbitrary encroachment and vulnerable to violence. No state can wholly make you secure. So they're saying, look, your theory is demanding the impossible. Well, I mean, that's obviously true. Unfortunately, police forces don't operate perfectly. Everybody knows that. But so it's not something that the neo-Roman writers failed to recognize. On the contrary, what happens is that in effect, they reformulate their basic claim about civil liberty as a doctrine of what they call fundamental rights. And that is a view which has become very important in the common law tradition in the United Kingdom, in the United States of America, and so on. So here, the neo-Roman theorists are opening up an important distinction in early modern political thought. Think about the notion of a right. In Anglophone political philosophy at this present time, the usual way of thinking about rights is to treat them as universal moral claims. They originate outside the state. They are everywhere the same. They make claims upon the state. The basic duty of the state is to uphold these rights of nature, what came to be called natural rights, what now tend to be called human rights. And the state has that obligation on pain of losing its legitimacy. And of course, the best known exemplar of exactly that analysis of rights in the Anglophone tradition is again John Locke. But by contrast, the legal theorists of the early modern period introduced this idea of fundamental rights, which they also describe as fundamental liberties, in the plural, liberties. As far as I can see, this is a small historical aside, that vocabulary was introduced, first of all, with great suddenness, by the way, by the opposition to the monarchy at the time of the outbreak of the English Civil Wars in 1642. But by the time the British Constitution is settled in 1688, there was something called the Bill of Rights, which is still law in my country, which is a list of fundamental rights. Now, this list of fundamental rights is not a universal moral claim. It doesn't claim to be that. It is avowedly a social construction. It's simply a list of what members of one specific political association have taken over a long tract of time to be essential to upholding their particular interests. And here's the crucial point. The status of being a free person, in this understanding, is equated with the capacity to exercise freedom of choice, at least in relation to these fundamental liberties. And the Bill of Rights, the British Bill of Rights, the American Bill of Rights, they give you the list. And it became a very familiar list: the right to life, and hence to self-defense under all circumstances; the right to personal liberty, by which they mean, again, back to the Roman law, habeas corpus, you may not be imprisoned without trial; and finally, the right to property. Now, you may get that term property wrong, because they have the old-fashioned way of using that term, which is still available in the English language, which talk about somebody's properties. Do they have a certain property? For example, a sense of humor. Do they have that property? We could say that. By properties, they include those. And that's very crucial in a writer like John Locke, that, as he puts it, you have property in your own person. You own yourself. You're responsible for your own properties. So the claim is, any society that gives its people life, liberty, and property is a society of liberi homines, free persons. Okay, there's my exposition. Now, there are two further things I want to do in the talk. And one is to note that as this theory has increasingly come to be discussed again in recent years, it's been very heavily criticized. I confess that a lot of these criticisms seem to me just misunderstandings. I mean, as you will perhaps agree, the analysis I've gone through has certain complexities, and people haven't bothered with these. However, there are two objections that I think are serious, and that anyone who wants to defend the theory, as I want to do, does have to say something about those. Let me quickly take up these two critical points. One is this theory is unduly restricted. It's only about person-to-person relations, and forms of subjection in civil society often, it's urged, arise from institutional inequalities, and that the norms of civil society may make this hard to identify. Now, very important work has been done along these lines by living at their mercy. But it may be just that you are, as the digest says, prevented from doing something. What's the relative importance of being stopped from doing something because you're at somebody else's mercy, and stopped from doing it because you're interfered with, you're impeded, you're prevented, hindered from doing it? Okay, defenders of the neo-Roman view initially gave the wrong answer here, there's no doubt about it. And that even includes Philip Pettit, where he says, look, freedom must be equated with what he calls non-domination. I mean, I don't like that term, but anyway, you see what he means. So the interference doesn't come into it. Now, that is obviously wrong. And people like Professor Tallis and others have pointed this out. I mean, for example, I mean, this is a weird example, but it's one of the ones that Professor Tallis gives. Suppose I handcuff you while you're asleep without your permission, and you wake up and you find that you're handcuffed. Surely someone has interfered with your freedom of action. I mean, how can that be denied? Well, it can't, of course. What Pettit and people fail to notice is that there's a crucial distinction you must make if you're a Republican theorist of freedom, which is the distinction between restrictions that have the effect of taking away your standing as free persons, i.e., if you're subject to the power of somebody else, and restrictions which, while they limit your range of actions, leave your status as a free person untouched. Free persons who are legally coerced or suffer some hindrance do suffer freedom of action being limited. But that doesn't do anything to take away their status as free persons. By contrast, if you are subject to the will of someone else, you have no capacity to act freely at all, as we've seen. And so what the neo-Roman theorist wants to say, and what the Roman law says is, look, what incomparably matters more is not that you may have occasional deprivations of freedom of action because you suddenly find you're handcuffed, but because you have no power to act according to your will. So there is the fundamental neo-Roman case. Okay, I promised to speak right up to the hour, but no longer. And so I now come, I promise I'll keep to time. That's the only really important thing about lectures, isn't it? And I want to conclude, as I promised, by saying, well, why might this theory now matter to us? Should you be a neo-Roman in your view about civil liberty and rights? And I want to say yes. You should be. So why? I just want to make 3 points about what I think of as the value of the theory. One I've already touched on, and important research is being done on this, and it is that this is a large claim. This is a theory which I believe presents us with a way of thinking about human rights that is arguably a lot more useful than current accounts. May I talk about current accounts for a moment? Amongst contemporary political philosophers, certainly in the Anglophone tradition, these rights are, as I've said, usually treated as universal moral claims that everyone can make upon everyone. So they're logically prior to all systems of government. They stand outside the political realm and they judge it. In the Anglophone tradition, the most important tract of recent times, which is offered exactly that argument, is John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, 1971. And of course, many, many followers of Rawls, Honora O'Neill and others. But I'm also thinking of writers like Martha Nussbaum or Amartya Sen, who've analyzed the concept of rights in terms of what they call human capabilities. You get the same outcome. Human capabilities stand outside state systems and must be recognized by them. Now, there's a huge problem with thinking about human rights like that, which is that it's very hard for the list of alleged human rights not to inflate into an account of everything that you judge desirable for a good life. That inflation, I mean, think about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, I sometimes think there would be no semantic loss if instead of saying there is a human right to, the Declaration had said it would have been nice if. I mean, for example, one of the human rights listed in the Declaration is the right to 2 weeks paid holiday a year. Well, that would be nice. But what more is being said? So there's inflation. And an understandable reaction to that inflation has been to say, look, yes, that isn't the way to go. And an important strand of thinking in Anglophone political philosophy at the moment is to say, look, the theory of human rights can only be an account of how feasibly to provide certain basic goods that can be provided within existing institutional frameworks. So, for example, James Griffin's book on human rights, or Podgy's book on world poverty and human rights, they take exactly that line. But you might say, well, there's a problem with that approach as well, which is that it valorizes existing institutions. It doesn't offer a critique of them. And so I think there is a certain stalemate in the discussion of how to conceptualize the notion of a human right, and that the Neo-Roman story offers us a different way. This is being very brilliantly explored, amongst others, by Professor Lena Haldenius, especially in her books on feminist republicanism. Very important work. And as Haldenius points out, the Roman law view would be that the right way to think about human rights, without inflation, but without valorizing existing institutions, is to treat them as what I've been, and what they were calling, fundamental rights. The outcome of that approach would be a list of co-enjoyable rights that all existing governments would have to make it their business to uphold against possible acts of interference. So, for example, habeas corpus. So, for example, the right to security of life. So you get an account of human rights that is not subject to inflation. It's quite restricted, but it's not confined to this so-called possible minimum. It could be used as a very powerful critique, for example, of authoritarian regimes that lock people up without trial. I mean, that is, you don't want to say that's a human right, but it's a co-enjoyable right. Your having it doesn't stop everyone else having it. And any legitimate government, the claim would be, should respect it. Surely I want to say, this is my first point, this is a view of rights that needs to be further explored, for it would be by each country. Think of one's country, think of its constitution, think of reform in these terms. A second and related value I see in the Neo-Roman theory is for Democrats. If you're not a Democrat, you can stop listening at this point. But for Democrats, the crucial point is that this theory secures a conceptual connection between individual liberty and the upholding of a specific form of government, namely, at least a representative democracy. It is very important that the liberal understanding of freedom as absence of interference is indifferent to forms of government. I quote the most famous statement of our times in the Anglophone tradition on liberal theory of freedom, Isaiah Berlin, Two Concepts of Liberty. I quote, "There is no connection between individual liberty and democratic rule." I'm quoting. "Liberty consists in not being interfered with by others, and so is concerned with the area of control, not with its source. We might find ourselves suffering less interference and thereby enjoying more freedom under the regime of a benevolent despot than under any system of self-rule." Now, you must not give up and go down that track. I mean, democracy is in sufficient trouble without pulling the rug out from under it with a view of freedom. According to the neo-Roman freedom, you can only live as a free person, that's to say, able to act according to your will, if two constitutional conditions are satisfied. One, we've seen, your fundamental rights must be secured. And the other is that by a process of equal representation, your voice must be capable of being equally heard along with all others, at least by representation, unless you're Rousseau, of course, in the making of the laws under which you live. Because if your voice is not heard, then the law does not express your will. If your voice is heard, then the law may be said to express your will and you consent in obeying it. But the reason for this requirement is that if the law does not express your authorized will, then you are subject to somebody else's will. So you're not a free person. So it seems to me that that gives the Democrat an automatic preference for the neo-Roman view of freedom. Now, the final point I want to make is really one that brings us up to date. And when I first thought about this issue of freedom, it wasn't really present to our minds, but it's very present to them now, which is that we live under systems in which there are silent forms of power that take away freedom of choice. Consider the extent to which de-unionized workforces, or even worse, undocumented aliens, currently live at the mercy of employers who can dismiss them at will, and they have no legal redress. Now, the loss of liberty they suffer does not necessarily stem from any overt act of interference or of intimidation. It stems from the mere fact that they are living at the mercy and thus subject to the arbitrary will of others, and have to model their behavior in such a way as not to cause offense. Do not ever have autonomy of action. So there are silent ways in which autonomy is taken away. Now, here's a further and more insidious form of a silent type of power. Think about the growth of the surveillance state, as it's beginning to become called. Surveillance from corporations and from states. So how, for example, do you react to the current business model of digital and social media companies? They provide free services, which enable them covertly to acquire a mass of personal information about you, so that you are left subject in an important domain of your life to an unaccountable form of power, which may act for your own benefit, but over which you have no control. That's the model. Now, of course, this danger is recognized, but it's usually, I'm so struck by this, it's usually said that this is an affront to privacy, which it is, of course. But the neo-Roman was saying, well, look, you're missing the point. This is not just an affront to privacy. This is an affront to my standing as a free person. I mean, if you hand over your personal data to people who can thereafter use it for undisclosed purposes, you've made yourself to that extent dependent upon their will. Now, you may, of course, think that the benefits of being on Facebook outweigh those disadvantages. But what the Neo-Roman says is, well, all right, you can always become a voluntary slave, but is that wise? Well, I'm up to time, exactly. Can I have 1 minute, Jan, to end on a more cheerful note? I strongly feel that many individual values as well as social goods would accrue to us if we were to think in more Neo-Roman terms. For one thing, the possession of the freedom to live as I choose in consequence of not being subject to other people. In the old sexist vocabulary, being your own master, that's of highly instrumental value. I mean, if I'm secure from interference, I can serve my own purposes and I can gain a distinctive sense of efficacy and worth as a result. But I think that this Neo-Roman view of freedom is also an intrinsic value. It helps you with changes of exploring ranges of choice. And it's a condition of exercising other important human capacities, deliberating in your own time, on your own terms, being timely about deciding on your life, and so on. So here I really do draw to a close. I think that one goal we should be setting ourselves is insisting on our status as free persons in Neo-Roman style. Thank you all very much.